Hello, and welcome to lesson 37. We're going to learn how to make several kinds of conditional sentence, which will give us a chance to use the subjunctive and the optative some more as well. So I'm going to start with simple conditionals because they are very simple. Um, to make a simple conditional sentence, you just use the word a, if, plus the indicative in the if clause, and then another indicative in the then clause. And the tense of the indicative will just be dependent on what you're trying to say. So let's look first at this one. E ho hippos tu luku ekusen efugen. So here I have an A and an aorist indicative active and another aorist indicative active. If the horse heard the wolf, it fled. We'll look at another one here. E ho hippos tu luku akue theuge. So here I have A again, then akue, present indicative active, theuge, present indicative active. If the horse is hearing a wolf, it's fleeing. So simple conditions are really simple, and they can come again with any tense of the indicative, although usually not the future. If you have the future, if you have a future indicative in both the if clause and the then clause, that's a little strange. It's called a future most vivid, and you see it in things like warnings. It's pretty intense. We're going to look at other ways to make future conditions that aren't quite as emphatic as that. So here's a chart of all the other kinds of conditional sentence. Okay, so the kinds of conditional sentences here, and then what they have in the if clause, which we call the protasis, it's the thing that's set up before, and what they have in the then clause, which we call the apodosis, because that's the thing that's given from the protasis. Okay, so you can see have, how did that happen? How did I do that? So here's a chart of all the non-simple kinds of conditional sentence. And you can see that in the if clause, they all either have a or they have aon, which is a combination of a plus the particle on. And actually, there's an alternative to aon. You can also see it on with a long alpha or ain. Those are both contracted forms of aon. So in the protasis, they all have aon or on with a long alpha or ain or a. And then in the apodosis, some of the ones that don't have on in the protasis have it in the apodosis instead. In fact, only past generals don't have an on in either clause. And then they have a mix either of the subjunctive or the optative or the indicative. So let's go through them one by one, talk about what they mean and how we translate them. So first, let's look at present generals. And these have aon or ain or on with a long alpha plus subjunctive in the protasis, the if clause, and a present indicative in the apodosis, the then clause. So here's our example. Aeon ho hippos luku akuse theoge. So we have an aeon and an aorist subjunctive because I wanted aoristic aspect. We could have had a present subjunctive if we wanted imperfective aspect. And then in the apodosis, a present indicative. If the horse hears a wolf, or if the horse ever hears a wolf, it flees. The reason we might want to put an ever in the translation, if the horse ever hears a wolf, is to show in English what the subjunctive and the on show in Greek, which is that this is generalizing. It's not like a simple condition where we're talking about a specific instance at a specific time. Okay? So, eon ho hippos luku akuse theoge. If the horse hears a wolf, it flees. If the horse ever hears a wolf, it flees. Now let's look at a past general. Okay. E ho hippos luku akusai etheugen. Okay, so it has a plus the optative. Again, I've chosen an aorist optative, but I could have chosen a present optative to get imperfective aspect, and an imperfect indicative. If the horse ever heard a wolf, it fled. So now, present contrafactual. Present contrafactual condition is one that's talking about present time, but a contrafactual, a contrary to fact condition, something that's not happening in present time. Okay, so that uses a plus the imperfect indicative in the protasis, imperfect indicative and on in the apodosis. So e ho hippos luku ekuen etheugenon. If the horse were hearing a wolf, but it's not, it would be fleeing. Okay, present contrafactual. Now, past contrafactual. That uses a plus the aorist indicative in the protasis, aorist indicative plus on in the apodosis. E ho hippos luku ekusen ephugenon. If the horse had heard a wolf, it would have fled. Okay, so aorist indicative in both clauses, and we're always going to translate it if had, then would have. Now, future more vivid. We saw that you can make a simple condition in the future, just using the future indicative and a in the protasis and no ons at all. But it's very rare, and that's called the future most vivid. Much more common is the future more vivid. That uses aeon plus the subjunctive in the protasis, and then a future indicative in the apodosis. So Aeon hol hippos luku akuse theuxetai. So I have my aorist subjunctive here. I could use a present subjunctive if I wanted imperfective aspect. And I have my future indicative right there. If the horse hears a wolf, it will flee. You can also have a future less vivid for things that are unlikely in the future. And those use a plus the optative in the protasis, optative plus on in the apodosis. So e ho hippos luku akusai fugayon. If the horse should hear a wolf, it would flee. We tend in English to translate these with should and would. Should in the protasis, would in the apodosis. If the horse should hear a wolf, it would flee. But probably it's not going to happen. Okay, so that's a review of all the kinds of conditional sentences. A thing I'll note is that all of these conditional sentences, if you have a negative in the protasis, you're going to use may. If you have a negative in the apodosis, you're going to use oo, right? So may in the protasis, oo in the apodosis. Now you can actually replace the protasis, the if clause, with a participle. So let's look at examples of those. And so for each of these, I maintain up here what it would be if we were writing out as two full clauses rather than using a participle. And then we'll do it with a participle down here in the example. So here's a present general. Ho hippos luku me akusas ou feuge. So notice that in a regular present general, we'd have had aeon in the protasis, but we've replaced the protasis here with a participle that's modifying the horse. I've made everything negative so we can get some practice with the mays and the oohs. We've gotten rid of the A, And we've gotten rid of the on. If there's an aon in the protasis or an a in the protasis, which there's always one or the other normally, you get rid of them when you do it with the participle. Okay? All right. So hohippos luku me akusas ufuge. If the horse doesn't hear a wolf, it doesn't flee. Now let's do a past general one. Remember, if we were doing it with full clauses, we'd have had a plus the optative and the imperfect indicative. But we're going to replace this protasis with a participle. And again, I've chosen this aorist participle here. So we're getting rid of the a and the optative. We get rid of the a altogether. Hohippos luku me akusas uk epheugen. If the horse didn't hear a wolf, it didn't flee. Notice we have our may in the protasis, or our may with the participle, and our uk in the apodosis. In fact, this is the only time, these are circumstantial participles. It's a kind of circumstantial participle. And this is the only time, conditional protases are the only time you're going to see may with a circumstantial participle. All the other circumstantial participles use u. Okay? So now here's a present contrafactual. Remember, if we were doing it with full clauses, the protasis would have a plus the imperfect indicative, and the apodosis would have the imperfect indicative plus on. Okay? But we're swapping out this protasis, so we'll get rid of the a. So, hippos luku me akuon uk epheugenon. If the horse weren't hearing a wolf, it wouldn't be fleeing. This time I chose a present active participle, so it has imperfective aspect. Okay? Remember, a past contrafactual condition would have a plus the aorist indicative in the protasis, aorist indicative plus on in the apodosis. So if we're going to replace this protasis with a participle, get rid of the a. Hippos luku me akusas uk efugenon. And this time I went with the aorist participle again for simple aspect. If the horse hadn't heard a wolf, it wouldn't have fled. So you can see, once again, we have may with the circumstantial participle because we have may in a protasis, and we have uk in the apodosis, the then clause. Okay? Notice too, I translated this, even though we've replaced the protasis in Greek with a participle, I still translated it as if we had a real protasis there. Future more vivid. Remember, if we had a full protasis, it would have aon plus the subjunctive, and then in the apodosis, we'd have our future indicative. So here's an example where I've replaced that protasis and gotten rid of the aon. I've replaced that protasis with a participle. Hohippos luku me akusas u feuxetai. If the horse doesn't hear a wolf, it won't flee. Okay? Again, may with the participle shows us that this must be a conditional participle. Okay? Finally, let's look at a future less vivid conditional sentence. And remember that normally they use a plus the optative in the protasis, optative plus on in the apodosis. So if we replace the protasis with a participle, right, and get rid of the a, we have hohippos luku me akusas ukan fugai. If the horse should not hear a wolf, it would not flee, right? Again, these are these should, would kind of clauses about unlikely events in the future. Good. So remember, for all but simple conditional sentences, including future most vivids, here's your chart. And you may want to keep one nearby while you're working on these. Keep an eye out for participles replacing the protases of all of these kinds of conditions, in which case you're going to lack the A, and if there's an on in the protasis, that will go away too.